Hello. I wonder if you could tell me, because I really don't understand where fundamental Islamism has come from. Has it always existed, and we've just kind of heard about it in the last 20 years? Or is it more a response to traditional societies, trying to be dragged into the 20th, into the 20th century, and the men who want to keep control, as they always do, trying to resist that change. I mean, could you briefly explain where fundamentalism has emerged from?
Just as an ordinary sort of slow-moving humanist, atheist, whatever, opposed to Islam and fixed ideas of that kind, what action would you recommend someone like myself could take to move things forward? We're a mixed society. We need somehow to be able to coexist in some way, and we need to challenge extreme views. What should I do?
Question from half-time. Do you feel that the growth of Islamophobia amongst politicians of all parties, Islamophilia amongst politicians of all parties stems from political correctness and the liberal apologists?
I think the first question and the last question are kind of linked. I mean, I think Islamism is a relatively new phenomenon. It's a contemporary movement. It's not an old movement. And it is, I think, if you look at the situation in Iran, in contemporary politics, it begins there in the sense that you've got an Islamic regime that takes hold, and since then you've seen the exportation of Islamism across the world. And I think part of that has to do with US foreign policy during the Cold War, because a lot of these Islamist groups were actually funded and trained by the US government. The Taliban and so on. The whole idea of US foreign policy at the time was to create a green belt, an Islamic belt around the Soviet Union. And of course, and I gave you the example of Iran, where it was a left-leaning revolution. It wasn't an Islamic revolution, but it was, in a sense, co-opted and suppressed by the Islamic movement with the, go-ahead given by Western powers at the Guadeloupe conference. And so, again, though, I don't want to sound like those people who are, it's all the West's fault, That's, in a sense, what brought this movement to center stage, because it wasn't a movement that had center stage in places like Iran and elsewhere. And today, though, this movement is standing on its own 2 feet, so it's not necessarily getting support from Western powers, though some segments of it are. For example, you have the British government fighting the Taliban, but then in Afghanistan they're also setting up Sharia courts. How helpful of them. You've got the US talking about a war on terror, but on the other hand, they've got very close relations with the Saudi regime. And so, in a sense, it is a movement that is vying for a piece of the pie of power, in a sense. I would say that with the politicians, I think if you look at the British government, I think it's not so much political correctness, but there is a benefit to religion in the public space. And I'm sure you see it with Christianity as well. It helps the people in power to rule, to divide, to separate. And it's, so in that sense, I think it suits them quite perfectly. They've never had a problem with Islam in political power. As I mentioned, they have very good relations with various Islamic states. They have supported and funded the Taliban. Today, they're talking about a return of the Taliban in Afghanistan. 20 years from now, if they're still around, ISIS will most probably be having meetings with the British government. It eventually is given a respectable face, and then suddenly they're called, moderate Islamists. Al-Qaeda is also against the beheadings of ISIS. So tomorrow, who knows? They'll be the moderates, But so I think there is, profit to be made. There is political and economic interest in this. But also, I think the fact of the matter is that a lot of these groups are still being supported by governments. What I think the British government is concerned about, or Western governments are concerned about, is not necessarily Sharia laws or the burqa and so on and so forth, which is why we see the rise of the influence of these things, but it's concerned only of terrorism, and not terrorism in a marketplace in Nigeria or terrorism in Pakistan, but terrorism here against its citizens. And so I think this is one of the problems, and I think the BHA and others have also fallen into this trap that they only are opposed to the terrorist wing, but Islamism's political wing normalizes, justifies, and advances its terrorist wing. The more Sharia courts you have in a country, the more unsafe people's lives are. I mean, a great example is Pakistan. They gave the Swat Valley to the Islamists. They said, in order to stop Islamic violence, they will give Sharia courts and so on and so forth to the Islamists there. If they have their own rules, they won't be bothering us. But it has seen, there has been a rise in violence as a result. And I think what's important for governments to realize is that there is a link between them. And I think that's really the reason why we're seeing less of a sort of fight back when it's needed. On recommendations on what can be done, I mean, obviously, I think we need to get rid of multiculturalism and multi-faithism, not as a wonderful lived experience. I'm all for as many immigrants as possible. I despise UKIP. But, multiculturalism, what it's done is just divided people into communities and groups. It's segregated them. And it's handed over people to reactionary organizations and religious groups. And what's happened is we no longer have citizens in this country. You know, the state is no longer responsible for large segments of its citizens because Islamic organizations and Sharia courts have taken over the job of the courts, of the educational system. This is a prescription for disaster. Now, why are we surprised when there are young girls going to join ISIS? Why are we surprised that 600 British, many of them British-born people have gone and joined ISIS? You know, when you create a situation where they become the representatives of Muslims and when they are given free reign to walk in universities, to organize in universities. I'm not allowed in universities, but they are. Universities UK has defended gender segregation. They had issued a guideline saying gender segregation is okay as long because if it's needed to respect the wishes of the external speaker. Gender segregation is gender apartheid. It's what South Africa did against black people. Now the Islamists are doing against white people, and it's suddenly fine. Women, and it's suddenly okay, you know, because it's people's right to religion. And I think in that sense, it's important to be able to criticize it, to also see the distinctions between Islam, Islamism, and Muslims. The thing I was trying to say, we need to stop people from stop saying this is British Muslims are outraged at the way Cage was treated. Look at the list of people who've supported Cage. They are Islamist organizations. They're not British Muslims. You know, and I think the other thing is citizenship rights, universal rights, and also a defense of secularism, not the wishy-washy sort of British secularism we're ending up with. This is dangerous. You know, people fought and died for secularism, and today we need to fight for it, hopefully not die for it. But it's a concept that is, you know, being eroded. And I know Britain is not a secular state by any means, but it is a secular society. And we need to fight for a strengthening of secularism and show how secularism is good for all people, religious or non. And I think that's the key. And also, I think, you know, supporting groups like ours. You know, this group, Islamic Education and Research Academy, I mean, they're a hate group, really. They're fascists. They defend stoning, they defend FGM, they defend the beheading of apostates, which they say is a painless way to go. There's evidence in our book on all the things that they've said. They've got charitable status and we don't. You know, the British government said we can't have charitable status. We don't want charity status anyway because it's a way of co-opting and depoliticizing groups. But we just did it just to prove a point. We can't get charity status because we defend secularism and because we are seen to be a political organization. What is this? What are the Sharia councils in this country are charities. Charities which are marrying people, young children, which are denying women divorce rights, which are justifying and legitimizing domestic violence. There is a problem here. It's too much privilege to religion, not enough, not enough looking at secularism, citizenship rights, universal rights. We need to go back to the basics.
Mariam, I was interested in your remark about you're not allowed in universities. I read a recent, I'm from St Andrews originally, St Andrews University. Not the university, but just from St Andrews, yeah. They pride themselves on being one of the oldest universities in Scotland, for instance, 1400 odd. It was, what 600 years, 800 years, centenary last year. Something like that, 614, yeah. Now, I read, I think we all read on the humanist thing about this article by the lecturer, the economics lecturer from St Andrews on Charlie Hebdo, the right to offend. I would like to hear of you applying to speak the same speech you've delivered tonight to St Andrews University, and if it's refused, I would take great delight. I've already been published in Scotland calling the SNP dishonourable for splitting our union. I talk as a British Scot with loads of blood on the deck, along with our fellow English, Irish and Welsh and Commonwealth. So no problem there about union. And I would take great delight in personally making sure that a big letter was published where you refuse the right to speak at St Andrews University.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. It gave me a lot to think about, particularly things like Sharia law, which parts of the British establishment say is a voluntary thing for people to take up, but you gave perhaps might be a more truthful version of what's going on. I wonder if I'd just make a contribution and then just end with a question. You started off by talking about how the extreme violence of Islamists is not shared by hosts of Muslims around the world. Although I thought towards the end of your speech you seemed to be in general condemning Islam. So I wondered if you could just clarify that. On the Charlie Hebdo debate, yes, I think everyone should have the right to offend. I'm not sure if I'd want to buy a copy of a magazine that, with cartoons of Jesus and Mary in sex acts and that, but, defend the right of people to offend. I'm just interested in what was the first question that was asked here. As you said, the extreme Islamism is, and the terror associated with it is a contemporary thing. It must have some roots somewhere. Now, if it's emerged over the last 30 years, and we know in the last 30 years, 40 years, we've had the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and, the West in Afghanistan and Iraq and those events. You seem to be saying that is only one side of the explanation for the rise of Islam. I wonder if you could just elaborate a bit more on that. I mean, finally, I think the giant demonstrations in France following the events in Charlie Hebdo were wonderful. What disappointed me was the fact that all the Western leaders that went over there for the photo opportunity to link arms, on the front of it, the very same people, been curtailing civil liberties in their own countries, pushing, as you said, Muslims in their own countries into the hands of extreme imams, and that have been sending their armies, imperialist armies, to the Middle East, and that. And those very people stand there, Je suis Charlie, and all that. That's a disgrace, a disgrace.
And one of the questions on the card, bearing in mind the fanaticism and blind belief of followers of Islamism, willingness to commit suicide attacks, etc., how do we turn these people away from Islamism? Do we have to accept we have lost them.
Thank you for those questions. On the universities, I'll be sure to take up your offer if St. Andrews refuses my entry. I think on the question of Sharia law, there's a couple of things. One is that, we often hear that it's voluntary. And Sharia courts are practiced in two ways in this country. One is via the Sharia councils, which are charities and seen to be mediation bodies. But you saw the judges, they call themselves judges, and they say that you cannot go against their decisions are final. And there are also Muslim arbitration tribunals which use the Arbitration Act. There's nothing wrong with the Arbitration Act. There are over 300 arbitration courts in this country to deal with issues that are specialized, like people who want to go to someone who knows a detailed business issue and doesn't want to go to a regular judge because they won't understand all those specifics and context. It's not meant to be used for family matters. It's certainly not meant to be used for criminal matters. Domestic violence in this country is a criminal matter. I know it's not for the Sharia courts. And family matters, child custody matters, child welfare is paramount in this country. And Sharia courts are being used to deal with these issues. The problem is that it is not allowed, but it is not illegal to do it. And therefore they carry on doing it, and they've carried on doing it. So you've got, in a place like Islington, 2 years ago, 30 cases coming up to Islington County of underage marriages, including one of a 5-year-old. There are many horrors, which I can't go into now, and more that you will soon hear about. But what I want to say is that hiding behind the issue of voluntary misses the point totally, because the fact of the matter is that we aren't taking into consideration the pressure that a lot of people are under to go to these courts. And second of all, how can, the other aspect of arbitration is that the two people are on equal standing. How can you be on equal standing when a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's? It's like saying that black people in South Africa voluntarily wanted the Bantustan. I'm sure there were some who said they liked the Bantustan. But that's irrelevant. My point is, even if not one woman comes forward to say that she has been mistreated in the Sharia courts, but there are, because there are reports on them, which are also published in our report. Even if not one woman came, the fact that the law itself is discriminatory should raise alarm bells, yeah? But they don't. And so I think it's something to be very concerned about, not from the UKIP, EDL perspective that, oh no, our Christian country is being overrun by these Muslims, but from the perspective of human rights, of women's rights, of citizenship rights. These people are our citizens. They are one of us. And we are sitting by and letting them being relegated to courts that treat women in this horrendous way. And there are many other examples of what they've done. Anyway, on Islamist violence, yes, again, I said that there's a conflation between Islam, Islamism, and Muslims. And I'm trying to see the person who, yeah. And yes, for me personally, I don't like to get into debates on Islam because it's a no-win situation. Someone will say that it's lovely. There are Islamic feminists who tell us how wonderful it is. The surah where, Surah Al-Nisa, where, husbands are allowed to beat their wives. They don't have to beat them right away. First, they have to, see if they'll listen, and then throw them out of their rooms or whatever. And then only they're supposed to beat them, and only with a small, very light stick. And even in the Sharia courts, they say, well, is there a mark on you? Did he hit your head? Well, that's not violence. Yeah, you can beat people as long as there's no violence. Well, I'm sorry, for me, that just doesn't cut it. Islamic feminism, to me, is an oxymoron. Islamic human rights is an oxymoron. Any religion and human rights is an oxymoron. You cannot have a defense and respect of women's rights, equality under religious law, full stop. And you should know that better than anyone else. So my point is that, Islamism is the problem, but Islam is its banner. What are you going to do about that? You can't go out and say Islam is a religion of peace, as a lot of people do, and it's not Islam, it's whatever, these fanatics. Well, it is Islam. ISIS is practicing Islam. The Islamic regime of Iran is practicing Islam. Okay, it's their interpretation of Islam. It's different from the interpretation women living under Muslim laws give. But I'm sorry, women living under Muslim laws, you're not the one making the rules. They are. And my point is that until they're in power, even many Muslims don't have the right to speak and breathe. And we've got to push them out of power. We need an enlightenment against them. And then only it won't really matter what it's said in the Quran. It's like Christianity. Doesn't it tell you to boil someone if they're rude to their parents and all of this nonsense, which you know better than me? But that doesn't mean every Christian believes it, and that doesn't mean that every Muslim believes the book. People are born into their religion. That's the sad part. That's the reality. The majority of people who are Muslims have never chosen to be Muslims, which is why the converts are the biggest fascists, because they're the ones who've actually read it and, they're born into it. I was born into it with no choice of mine. And unless you take that huge step of saying, I refuse, I reject, and you don't want to mess with your family and the flow, you'll carry on being it. So there's distinctions between Muslims, but I think we cannot leave Islam out of it. I'm sorry. We have to be able to challenge it. We have to be able to reject it. And there will be a day when we push Islamism back and the Quran will be like any other old book, full of rubbish, and it doesn't really matter. I want to take issue with the use of extreme Islamism. It gives the impression that there is a moderate Islamism, that there is a nice and cuddly one. Well, I guess Al-Qaeda is nice because it doesn't like ISIS's beheadings. The Islamic regime of Iran is better because it does its hangings in public squares using courts. And they've got a nice, smiley Islamist who is called a reformist, and things are nicer according to them. So I think we need to just, we don't say there's a moderate BNP and an extremist EDL or whatever. They belong to the far right, and I think we need to recognize that this movement is a fascist movement. There are no moderates. There are people who dupe the public into thinking that they're moderates. That's a different matter. On the rise of Islamism, yes, there are many factors, including, as I mentioned, the US foreign policy at the time. It's also the failure of the modernization project. It's also a failure of Arab secularism. But I think, it is US foreign policy that brought this movement to center stage. Khomeini was in Iraq, and then suddenly he's in Paris, where he's got all this access to the media. Nobody knows who the hell he is. And, a little while later, he's the head of the country. And I think, not being conspiracy theorists, these are the realities of politics at play. And very often it's dirty, and very often it's definitely at the expense of revolutions. We've seen it in the Arab Spring. What did they do to the Egyptian revolution? That beautiful revolution for freedom, for equality against dictatorship, Muslim Brotherhood goes on top. And working with the army, which was supposedly overthrown, and now the army's back, they just co-opted a revolution that had nothing to do with Islamist demands, because those demands mean they want Khalifa, they want Sharia, they want the Burqa. That's not what the demands of the Arab Spring were. And finally, I agree. It was just outrageous that these Western government leaders and leaders that have been at the forefront of, taking away the freedom of expression were standing there saying, Je suis Charlie. But I want to say this to you, that if it hadn't been for those countless people who came out on the streets, they wouldn't have given a damn. And the fact that we forced them to come and take a stand with Charlie is our win. And we need to see that. It's, if we create enough of a momentum in this country against Sharia courts, even the British government will come and say that they're against Sharia courts. What happened with Universities UK? We created enough of a momentum that even David Cameron came and said segregation at universities is wrong. And that's the role that these sort of mass movements play. And so we need to see the positive side of that. They didn't want to be left behind. from that movement that said Je suis Charlie, no ifs and buts. And about fanaticism, well, I mean, fanaticism exists in all forms, including, Breivik and the Christian right in Norway and the Tea Party and Christian right in America, very scary. I know there are differences, as there are differences in any phenomenon, but it's because of the access to power that there are differences, not because these groups are fundamentally better from the others. And I think obviously we can always get people back from Islamism. I mean, look at Quilliam Foundation and Majid Nawaz. He was an Islamist. Now he is our greatest ally, And I think there is a huge opportunity to pull people away from Islamism. We have a responsibility to do that. But it starts by stopping their access in schools. They have speakers going to schools and universities that are recruiting for ISIS. And it's fine. They're called Islamic Society or meetings, ISOC meetings, and it's fine. They're giving Qur'ans out for free. Imad's like shocked at the amount of Qur'ans he's got for free so he can recycle them. Just make sure no one else gets them. And, all this money is being poured, all this support. Where is the support we are supposed to get? Donations and otherwise. And what about all the secularists in other countries who we see very little solidarity for, because these are issues that somehow is too controversial. But the thing is, if we don't stand up, who is going to do that? And we have a real responsibility to do it.
Oh, hi, Mariam, and everyone. Yes, I think in this country we are, as you said, a secular society, but not a secular state. And at a much more benevolent level, humanists are actually discriminated against in educational institutions and all sorts of things. So we do have, this common bond. It's nothing like as bad, but it's as though anybody can claim to have a religion, and having a religion, be it Scientology or whatever, it's better than having no religion. And how can we address this issue? How can we address the discrimination that humanists don't speak in schools and all sorts of things like that? It is actually a political issue as well, because politics have a state religion. The state, religion, politics, they're all interlinked. So what can we do?
As an Iranian to another Iranian, I have to thank you for the good job you're doing. But I didn't quite understand from your talk where you were condemning the extremism, Islamists, and you were comparing some personalities from Muslim countries who have been either jailed, killed, and how were you comparing them or separating them with Islamists and Islam or Muslims, and then with Charlie Hebdo? That was a bit vague for me to understand, because I just make a quick comment, and that is I've been for many years around here locally, but very vocally if I could, by promoting the view of the so-called moderate Muslims within the society, that they should, if they are not really the ground for growing the extremism among them, they should be out in force. Every time there is an extremist act happens, either in UK by beheading the soldiers on the street, or going out and doing the type of beheading they do abroad. The majority of Muslims are, in my view, just as in fault or in in cooperation with the extremists, as long as they stay indoors and do not go out and condemn them.
Yes, I mean, humanists are discriminated against because religion has a privileged role in society here. But the way to go about that is not by making humanism into another faith or belief. And I think, when you do that, you create more space for religion and more discrimination against you. And you push away people like us who are too loud and too uncomfortable and just going too far. If you want to fight religion, you've got to fight it in its face. You've got to challenge it. It is brutal. It is barbaric. And you can't appease it, and you can't tiptoe around it, and you can't have interfaith meetings and I don't know whatnot. It's not going to work like that. It doesn't work like that. Throughout history, if you look at how things have changed, it's been full on. It's been a fight back. We're doing that. And not just us. We're just part of a very vast movement in Iran, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Morocco. In Morocco, it is banned to eat during Ramadan. What do? They go and publicly eat, facing beatings, facing imprisonment. So when groups in a country which is relatively free isn't willing to take those risks, isn't willing to show support, talks about, try not to cause gratuitous offense, to use your word. It's a huge problem, and we're not going to win like this, So we've got to be uncompromising, but not in the way they are. They are uncompromising because they won't allow anyone who is not like them to live. And the far right is exactly like them. But uncompromising in our defense of people, of rights, of freedoms, an uncompromising defense of secularism. Secularism is not a dirty word. We keep hearing about the aggressive secularists, the militant secularists. Yes, we're all of those and more. Because secularism is the only thing that is going to save, as a minimum, people in this country, people in Morocco, people in Iran, people in Afghanistan. We need to be proud secularists, even more than we need to be proud humanists, in my opinion. And my point with the photos was to show that Charlie, in the West, there's often this impression that it is only people like Charlie who get killed. And if they didn't draw cartoons, there wouldn't be any problem. My point was to show a number of people, of many more, who are being killed and imprisoned for doing even less than what Charlie did, or even more than what Charlie did. And that this movement is using the cartoons as an excuse. In Pakistan, they use the excuse that she's going to school, and they shoot Malala in the head. In another, they're saying, Raif was insulting Islam. 1,000 lashes. There are many Charlies across the world who've been imprisoned and killed long before anyone in the West knew about what Islamism was. Because in Iran, this movement slaughtered an entire generation to keep power. You've got grave sites, cemeteries called Khavaran. The Iranian regime calls it the place of the damned, where families go and it's just a mound. Nobody knows where their loved ones are buried. And they go there to commemorate their loved ones, even though they are beaten and arrested by the security forces. Yeah. So, it's important to see that. It's important to see that there are many who are opposed to this movement and who have been fighting much more bravely, much more resolutely than anybody here in the West, including myself, because they face real risks doing it. And the least we can do is to be unequivocal in our demand for universal rights, citizenship, and secularism, and to show real solidarity. The other issue is, on the moderate Muslims and Muslims being in collision. I don't agree. Because I think that I think that this is not just the responsibility of Muslims. You can only say that if you think that Muslims and Islamists are one and the same. If I want to argue that we need to push back the EDL, I don't say I want to see every white person who looks like the EDL has to be out on the street, otherwise they're colluding with the EDL. That's not the case. That's not the case. And I think it is, when we look at people only as Muslims, we accept the narrative that the Islamists have given. We accept identity politics. But many Muslims, or those who are considered Muslims, like myself, like my imam, how many times salam alaikum do they tell you? You know, it's just, they just have to look at you and they assume you're Muslim. How many have come out as secularists, as feminists, as campaigners on against homelessness, against the war? Because they don't come out with their Muslim identity. You know, so in that sense, I think it is not just something that is the responsibility of Muslims. It's the responsibility of everyone. If you despise fascism and the Islamist right, we all need to come out. And the other thing we need to remember, that it's much more difficult for people who are Muslim to do it, because many of them are living in a place like Tower Hamlets, where they've got Islamists having free reign of the roads and the society. You know, we just had an International Women's Day in Tower Hamlets, and we had to have police there. You know, people coming with scarves, covering their face, standing in the back, trying to intimidate us, threatening the venue. You know, so you've got to understand that it's much, much more difficult for people who are identifiable Muslim. And the thing I want to say is that the more we push, the more Muslims can come out. Not as Muslims, but as citizens. You know, just to give you an example, in Canada, there was a campaign against Sharia courts there, and it was a left socialist woman who ran the campaign. I went and spoke there and helped her with the campaign as well. And one of the things that I later heard just recently from Geeta Sahgal was that she was meeting with the Canadian Muslim Women's Council, Canadian Council of Muslim Women, who had joined the No Sharia campaign. And they had said that had we not done it, they would not have been able to. And I think that is very important, to push, push, push. What the problem is that while we're pushing, we're attacked by the left, the disgusting left, because I'm left myself. We're attacked by the far right. We're attacked by the government and the multiculturalists. We're attacked by progressives who think that this is people's right to religion. We're attacked by the feminists who are demanding that burqa has to be defended as women's right to dress. You know, we do feel like we're under attack and we're not getting enough support. But there is a lot of people who think like us, including humanists, including secularists, ex-Muslims, and so on and so forth. And I really believe we are a majority. But we need to convert that into action, which means we need you to support our campaigns. We need you to stand with us. We need you to talk to people, to say, don't blame immigrants, don't blame Muslims, focus on the Islamists, to explain it to people, and to help gather this storm of support for ex-Muslims and Muslims in this country, but also in other countries. So I don't see them in collusion. I think a beautiful book you should read is Karima Bennoun. She's an Algerian-American lawyer. She's written a book called Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. And she's interviewed over 300 Muslims or people from Muslim backgrounds who are fighting the Islamists, and to read their stories is enough to give you enough hope for the rest of your life. And the title of the book comes from a Pakistani play where the Islamists had come and said, you're not allowed to play music here. And those who were singing said, you know what, your fatwa does not apply here. And the place that was showing the play was bombed. The next day, they held it again. And 1,000 people came to see it with their children. And the guy who set it up, he said, but you know what happened here? There's been a bomb, it's dangerous. They said, no, we're coming. Those are the Muslims. Where are they? They're out there. The problem is that you can't see them because of the way identity politics has been set up. We need to see them. They are our allies, as are ex-Muslims, humanists, secularists. But we need to fight this fight. It's a historical fight, and it's one that we need to step up to. Thank you.